Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earthfiles reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
On New Year's Eve, 1952, at 9 p.m. Eastern, a mysterious group of 9 people assembled in Camden, Maine, in a luxurious house called the Round Table Foundation. They would become a mysterious group referred to as the Nine, and eventually would be linked to the work of another mysterious group called the Collins Elite, a religious front group operated by the Central Intelligence Agency. So who were they? And what was the CIA doing? One investigator and writer who tracked down who was in the Nine is Peter Levenda. In his 3 volumes about American political witchcraft entitled Sinister Forces, the first volume is subtitled The Nine. Levenda describes that the leader of the assembled group on New Year's Eve, 1952, was East Indian mystic Dr. D.G. Vinod, a Hindu who allegedly channeled something that said through Vinod, quote, "We are 9 principles and forces," close quote. With Vinod was Dr. Andrea Puharich, who worked for or with the U.S. Army and probably with the CIA as well. In Levenda's history of the Nine, he described Dr. Puharich this way, quote, "The story of Puharich is central to any study of the U.S. government's post-war interest in how psychology and parapsychology could benefit the intelligence agencies. It was arguably Puharich who was the first to bring the potential uses of paranormal abilities in military applications to the attention of the U.S. Navy. It was Puharich who introduced the Israeli psychic Uri Geller to American audiences and to American intelligence. Further, it was Puharich who formed a mysterious cabal that numbered many important and influential Americans among its members, a cabal that would deliberately attempt to make contact with alien beings and, according to some commentators, actually succeeded," close quote. Further, Peter Levenda then links Dr. Puharich to 2 major historic events in American history. First, to Operation Paperclip that brought German Nazi missile scientists to the United States and to White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico after the end of World War II in order to give America its own military missile industry. Levenda also links Dr. Puharich and Paperclip to the political earthquake of 1963 when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. 6 months after the original 1952 New Year's Eve first gathering of the Nine, on June 27, 1953, it was a full moon and 9 people gathered as so-called spiritual Brahmins. Peter Levenda writes, quote, "Puharich gathered around him what was to be a core group of the Round Table Foundation for another session with Channeler Vinod. The membership of this group of 9 members, the 9, were Henry Jackson, Georgia Jackson, Alice Bouveret, Marcella DuPont, Carl Betts, Vonnie Beck, Arthur Young, Ruth Young, and Dr. Andrea Puharich," close quote. Levenda explains the backgrounds of each person there that night, and then, a few pages later, reveals that the 9 channeled beings coming through Vinod were, quote, extraterrestrial beings living on an immense spacecraft hovering invisibly over the planet Earth. The assembled congregation of 9 humans have been selected to promote the agenda of the 9 extraterrestrials on Earth. As Puharich would later write in his biography of Uri Geller, we took every known precaution against fraud, and the staff and I became thoroughly convinced that we were dealing with some kind of an extraordinary extraterrestrial intelligence. Puharich became obsessed with the 9, seeing them behind every psychic encounter, every UFO sighting, and every paranormal event, close quote. After this brief message, joining us on Phenomena Radio tonight will be Ray Boeche, Doctorate of Theology, former Protestant Church Pastor, and currently Director of a Bereavement Program in Lincoln, Nebraska. Also joining us will be Nick Redfern, born in England and now a Texas resident who has authored more than a dozen books since 1997 about UFO high strangeness and government policies of secrecy and denial of the UFO phenomenon. We will dig into the alleged mysterious connections between the 9 and the later emergence of the CIA and Catholic-related Collins elite, which tried to study the UFO phenomena in the late 1980s to 1990s. When the Collins elite encountered lots of negative resistance, it allegedly brought in Ray Boeche to help get rid of the negative energies plaguing the Collins elite. Another startling revelation is that the Collins elite had a military cover in the Pentagon, which was the highly classified Department of Defense group known as AAWSAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Application Program. This secret office is also linked to AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that was first made famous by the New York Times front page on December 16th, 2017, when infrared jet fighter gun cameras were showing UFOs in the sky doing remarkable aerial maneuvers that shocked the human pilots running the infrared video cameras.
Thank you, Linda. You're listening to Phenomenon Radio live on the KGRA digital broadcasting station. Tonight's special guests, Dr. Ray Boeche and Nick Redfern, will join the show right after these messages.
Dom.
Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio. To start tonight's interview with special guests, Dr. Ray Boeche and Nick Redfern, here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Hey, thanks, Bill. And Ray and Nick, please, I'm telling you, I'm so glad to have you back on this show today on this subject. Welcome to Phenomena Radio.
Thanks, Linda.
And because in trying to do research about the relationships of the 9, the Collins elite, the military, the Defense Department, and all of that, Ray, over the last, going all the way back to the 80s, you and I have known each other because of R.A.F. Bentwater's research. And then in the 1990s, we had a common experience with people from the NSA and the DIA having to do with my work and work you were doing with them. And since that time, over and over again, come these statements from various people in various directions that when the Collins elite was formed via a back of the CIA, that the CIA backed them, and that they were to be a religious interface studying UFO phenomena, your name always comes up and questions come up about you being involved with that Catholic-related Collins elite. Can you start today with what you know about them? Have you ever played a role with them? And then you and I can talk some about our experiences with the NSA DIA people.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I the only thing I know about the Collins Elite are those things that I've read in Nick's book. I had never heard the term. Nick contacted me. He was interested in what had transpired between the two fellows that we called the writers and you and I. I knew nothing about the Collins Elite until finally Vince came out and got Nick's story. I sort of feel like the man who's on the end of the question, do you still beat your wife? Because no matter how I answer it, somebody is going to say, well, of course he is. He's just covering it up. But seriously, I know nothing about the Collins Elite other than what I've read in Nick's book. It was an extraordinarily interesting series of conversations and meetings between the writers and you and I as the intermediary. But I can't shed any more light than what's out there already. I would love to know what the Collins Elite is. I would love to know who is involved in it. I feel like, I believe as Nick does, they may call themselves the Collins Elite, but that's not the actual name of the group, at least not the official name.
Yeah, that's right.
Nick, why don't you pick up in here and put your lips closer to the phone?
Okay.
That's
well, basically, so people understand the situation, back in 2007, I contacted Ray because I knew he'd done some interesting work in Rendlesham, and that these two guys that Ray's mentioned had knowledge of Rendlesham. So we were chatting about this because at one point I was thinking about doing a Rendlesham book. And as we got talking, I forget the exact words, but Ray said something to the effect of, well, there's an even more interesting story, connected to all this. And of course, of keeping my inquiring head on my shoulders, I was like, oh, well, what's that? And Ray told me how he'd been approached by these two guys from the DOD who were quite concerned about the program they were working on, which involved these so-called NHEs or non-human entities, which were perceived, I think, at first as being extraterrestrial, but then the group came to believe that they were actually something demonic, something supernatural, and that a lot of things went wrong with the program, like a dark cloud came over it, and it became more of a realization from their perspective that they were dealing with something demonic. And with Ray's almost like a unique background, one as a MUFON state director for Nebraska, and also as a priest. You don't very often get those two combinations. And I think that's probably why, they approached Ray in 91 and had this meeting. Now, when Ray shared this story with me, I thought, wow, this is really intriguing. The idea that there's a group within the government or a think tank which is essentially being sponsored or funded to look into the demonic angle or the demonic theory for the UFO phenomenon. And we had sort of quite a long and extensive interview. I think it was like probably over several days, I think, when I would get back to him and we get sort of clarification on different things. And I was able to dig into this further. And between 2007 and 2009, I was able to interview somewhere in the region of 7 or 8 people who had contact and connections with the Collins Elite. Now, one of the things it's important to note, and I actually spelled this out in the book. Now, the book came out 8 years ago, in 2010, so it's pushing a decade old now. But one thing on page 42 that a lot of people completely overlooked, where one of the guys told me that the Collins Elite, and this is in the book, the Collins Elite was not its real name. He actually said it was, quote, an informal name that they used when they were speaking to people who weren't cleared to work, to have knowledge of the group, or who weren't in the employ of the group. So it's basically an informal name. And as I pointed out, I never did get the real name. It's kind of like the CIA. Its nickname is the company, and it's kind of like that. So there clearly is a still classified name, and the Collins Elite was just a name that they used to speak to people who weren't cleared, like me. And so that was the way the story began. Now, the more I dug into it, the more I found that although the group today is somewhat different to what it was back years ago, literally decades ago, but they started in the 50s by looking into people like Jack Parsons and his research and his connections with Aleister Crowley, and they made further connections with Crowley conjuring up this supernatural entity known as Lamb, which looks eerily like a classic alien grey, apart from the huge eyes. And so they were looking at threads and leads, and also looking in the 50s as to how some of the contactees were using Ouija boards to try and contact the so-called Space Brothers. And the group came to a realization that a lot of the people in ufology, like Jack Parsons, who had a deep interest in ufology, George Hunt Williamson, one of the early contactees who was using Ouija boards, they came around to the idea that this is not the way extraterrestrial nuts and bolts aliens and UFOs would work. And they came around, actually by the late 50s, early 60s, that this was the road to go down. Now, the important thing to note is that the group, as it was explained to me, was not like a place like it wasn't like they had a headquarters, like the CIA has a headquarters and the NSA does and the FBI does. It was like a very sort of fluid, like a think tank, which would get together perhaps 9 or 10 times a year and to figure out, what new data had been collected in favor of this demonic angle, and they would prepare briefings, etc., for people within government, the military, and the intelligence community, people within those communities who were open to this demonic theory. So in other words, they might be, the first meeting of the year might be in a particular office of the Pentagon. The next one might be in a room in the CIA. In other words, they were people who would get together and share with high-level people the latest developments. And now, they, by their own admission, they did not want to kind of open doors and let these things through, whatever they were, so to speak. They viewed it as something to definitively stay away from. But the guys that Ray met, and if I'm wrong, you'll correct me, but the guys that Ray met talked about how there'd been some experiments in which people had died, and he saw some of the photographs concerning this. And so it makes me think, and there are a number of issues that were brought up in the book, that there may actually have been more than one group looking at this demonic angle. One group, like the Collins Elite, that was trying to warn people of the hazards of this phenomenon, and another group that was almost trying to recklessly weaponize the powers, if you like, of this demonic phenomenon as they saw it.
I think that's a fair description, Nick. I think that was the two men that Linda and I were in contact with were so concerned because they were part of the group that was attempting to weaponize this. And that, I think, is what they found so frightening. Once they discovered that there was, this wasn't a neutral sort of thing, it wasn't a benign thing that could be controlled, but that they were convinced that it was ultimately an intelligence that had evil intentions.
And Ray, going to our work that I have put in Military Voices in my book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, I wanted to quote, it goes right to the heart of what you just said, from one of the transcripts of the floppy disk that you were helping get from them. And as far as I remember, one was DIA and one was NSA, correct?
That's correct.
And they had approached you, and that it was earlier, but by May of 1994, my third book, Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, had just been released that spring. And when you got in touch with me, you were talking about these two men who had approached you in your interest in eschatology, sort of the end of the world by unknown forces. And they wanted to discuss through these floppy disks and, I guess, transfer information to me with you as in between. And that's how I ended up getting a series of 2 or 3 of these floppy disks. What I want to quote from is the very first one that came with the date of June 21st, 1994, addressed to me about my book. And in here it says, the non-human entities that they call NHEs being dealt with in our psi mind control weapons development, and who are apparently allowing themselves to be used for a time by our government, are neither benevolent nor neutral. It was our feeling that very few could understand or accept this. And this is the reason we approached our mutual friend, which is you, Ray. We had become aware of him through his work on the British incident, RAF Bentwaters, in 1980, when his probings began to bother a number of high-level people within our government. Now, you were in communication with Senator Exxon from Nebraska, right?
Yes, for a several-month period of time.
So what do you think, in the context of where we are right now this minute on Phenomena Radio, why do you think that you're talking with Senator Exxon on this complex, multi-layered, possibly demons, possibly extraterrestrials, RAF Bentwaters, UFOs, Lamb, Aleister Crowley, Collins Elite, the Nine? What do you think was driving government insiders crazy?
I wish I knew. When Scott Colborn and I approached Jim Exxon, he, I think, politely showed some interest. And then as he began to understand there was much more to this than met the eye, it seems to me the tenor of conversation and communication that I had between his aides in Washington, his aides here in Nebraska, the whole tone changed to one in which Senator Exxon found something that apparently was incredibly disturbing. His aides informed me that he had handled the entire investigation himself. He'd made all his own phone calls. He'd written all his own letters. The staff was not involved. And his one aide said, I believe he's spoken to everyone in the Department of Defense about this. So whatever Jim Exxon discovered or uncovered or poked at the very end, he would, his staff here in Lincoln, particularly his personal assistant at his office here, was incredibly angry at me when I called to ask for a further interview for an article I was writing for Fate magazine. And she was beside herself because I had caused such angst and suffering in Jim Exxon's life because of this. And I thought, what in the world did he discover that could have upset him that much?
Right. What do you think?
I honestly, I have no idea. And as far as I know, neither did any of his staff, because they were puzzled because he had done everything. It wasn't like he said, hey, I've got this guy who's bugging me in Lincoln, Nebraska. Take a look at this and see what's going on. He did everything. And that happened after he had an initial conversation with Charles Halt, who was the deputy base commander at Bentwaters. I sort of orchestrated that, and they got in contact with one another. And that's when the whole tone changed. So I believe something that Colonel Halt shared with Senator Exon served as a key or a door to something else that really disturbed the senator. And I believe that had something to do with the psychotronic weapons work, mind control weapons work that these two scientists approached me about.
Right. And what I wonder, we know that Charles Halt has had many versions. His so-called truth has changed many times. And there has been a point where he was denying that it had anything to do with extraterrestrials. And then it was in, I believe it was the summer of 2009, that he released that press release with Gary Heseltine in the UK, saying that the lights and the beams that he had encountered in Rendlesham Forest were extraterrestrial in origin, are the three quotable words from his press release.
Yeah, it's a puzzling situation, because it's like trying to hit an ever-moving target, and you just don't. You could never. I guess the maybe even a better analogy is trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. It slips away from you all the time. There is a substantial truth out there. I don't know what it is, but I'd sure like to.
Well, before I throw this to my colleague, John Burroughs, for some insight on Halt, I would like to just pick up and add to your last sentence right then, going back to what we called the writers in my second volume, Glimpses Volume 2. And I made an error saying Glimpses Volume 2. What they called You About and Me was my Glimpses Volume 1. That was a look at crop circles, animal mutilations, human abductions, alien taxonomy. And that is the book that they wanted, and then ended up sending me all of the floppy disks about that. Then when I did 4 years later, Glimpses Volume 2 that I'm reading from, it has everything that they sent me and your and my experience. So now I am going to quote something from their 1994 floppy disk that may show how big this box was in the Pentagon by then, and that we tie back to my intro when I said that I learned another startling revelation is that the Collins elite had a military cover in the Pentagon, which was the highly classified Department of Defense group known as AAWSAP, Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program. This secret office is also linked to AATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, first made famous by the New York Times a year ago when they put those infrared videos out from the jet fighter cameras. So now, with that as the possible box, even back in the 90s, Ray, because you and I are not sure when AAWSAP began, but let's just assume if it's the big box here that has the money that goes back and forth and with AATIP, here is from their first floppy disk to me via your help. Your comments and thoughts in Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 1, concerning ancient civilizations and their contacts with the NHEs need to be considered in light of the bigger picture of the deception of mankind as a whole. If this grand deception is taking the course it seems to be, then it makes complete sense to analyze the false gods of ancient civilizations in light of the current level of deception. it is only logical that given their non-human, other dimensional nature, the NHEs would be able to foresee the need to establish a foundational base, the facts of which could be slightly twisted or distorted by the fog of antiquity and forgotten cultural distinctiveness, to seemingly establish themselves now as the bringers of all good things to humanity. This would be the ultimate deception. And explore Jacques Vallée's Passport to Magonia for more close parallels between the so-called fairy manifestation of the NHEs and current events. And look very closely at messengers of deception. Dr. Vallée was so close to the truth of the situation, with the exception that the ultimate manipulators are not human. So this is painting a huge picture in covering thousands of years of intelligences from another dimension that have been manipulating the whole planet for millennia.
We, at some time, sometimes it seems we are their playthings.
And how that goes to the heart of this question that Luis Elizondo himself, the new director of the To the Stars group that is in collaboration with Lou Elizondo, who ran AATIP in the Pentagon between 2007 and 12. Lou Elizondo told a group in a MUFON presentation in the summer of 2018 that part of the reason that AATIP was closed down and lost funding was because people in the Pentagon became scared or convinced that we were dealing with demons. Like it's the same thing you've just talked about going back into the 90s. So, Ray, what if this whole big, huge box, going all the way back to the 50s in Puharich, it is because we're not dealing strictly with organic blood and flesh extraterrestrial biological entities. We're dealing with something that can come and go interdimensionally and for some reason harvests from our planet.
And I think, to me, that's really at the core of the whole problem. As Vallée said, and I'm unsure who said it first, either Vallée or John Keel, that the extraterrestrial explanation is just too simplistic for the phenomenon when you examine it as a whole. There are things going on that cannot be answered by extrapolating a physical presence doing this. It's beyond that. And the high strangeness aspects are so far beyond that of another material being. To me, that's been painfully obvious for years that is the case. To me, it was interesting that the information that came from the writers seemed to point in that direction and provide some clarification to that. We may want to mention too that I was completely unaware of what you had sent to the writers or what they had sent to you until you chose to share it with me. Right.
That's right.
So, yeah, I mean, I was simply the middleman, ferrying things back and forth. The reason that they asked you for the copy of the book, they were afraid to purchase a copy themselves because they didn't want it traced back to themselves.
Why?
And the purchase.
Their very first paragraph to me in that floppy disk, June 21st, 1994, quote, "Your book is an excellent, thought-provoking work. Overall, many salient points are covered well. Following are some random notes." In other words, they're basically saying your book is right on.
Yeah, they're making an affirmation there that what you're reporting is a true picture of reality. Now, then it gets a little more muddled because we have to say what what is this entire reality?
Yeah.
But you're laying out a foundation there. You're exposing things that had not been exposed before. And
in the holographic paradigm, it's a book, The Holographic Paradigm and Other Paradoxes, by Ken Wilber, I believe it was. He wrote, these worlds or dimensional levels are not separate regions, spatially divided from one another so that it would be necessary to move in space in order to pass from one to the other. No, the higher worlds completely interpenetrate the lower worlds, which are fashioned and sustained by their activities of penetrating dimensions.
Fascinating. That's a fascinating concept. It's a multi-layered, tangled jumble of facts. We get glimpses from the phenomena we can observe and that we can record, and which you do such an excellent job of reporting on. But these people are trying to take it to, and had, I believe, taken it to the next level where they'd established a taxonomy, they'd established an ordering of this, and were trying to expand their understanding of it in order to turn it to a weaponized use.
Yeah, and they talk about the deception with consciousness that they know that they're being manipulated in even the time that they are being allowed, quote unquote, to be played with and allowed to do something. And it is, when you think back, Ray, remember you and I and you going with them, you had gotten to the point where you asked them, if I flew to Lincoln, Nebraska, could all four of us meet privately?
Yeah, and I recall that.
Yeah, and that led to the last communication to you that you got to me. I can't remember by phone or letter, but I remember what it was. Linda, we cannot. It would be too dangerous for you and for us. That was the last communication.
Yeah, that was a very sobering thing. What I found very interesting about that, they were concerned about your safety.
Yeah, they were.
They weren't just concerned about themselves; they were concerned about yours.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was. I had limited personal contact with these two men, but I would say they were men of integrity without question. And they have potentially lied to me. I suppose so. I certainly didn't see it in any of their actions. I didn't see that they tried to embellish anything. And they always had this undercurrent of, this needs to come out. People need to be aware of this, but we have to protect ourselves and our families, and then ultimately protect you.
Yeah. And when you think back and realize that they were working inside of agencies, working with the Pentagon, with military forces that would have been involved with crash retrievals and extraterrestrials, that they are coming to a conclusion that they are dealing with something that is penetrating dimensions, is manipulative, has deceived humankind on Earth literally for thousands of years. And then you jump cut to the 2018 statement by Lou Elizondo, former director of AATIP, who in a speech in the MUFON conference says that the people in the Pentagon became convinced or afraid that they were dealing with demons and that's why everything was shut down, and he was frustrated. And yet here is a link that goes back to the 90s, goes back to the 80s, goes back to the 70s, and back further to the 9 and the so-called emergence of the Collins elite.
And the interesting thing to me in this when Elizondo made that statement, or when it came out, when I became aware that he'd made that statement, I thought, because he made it in a very, I think, very disparaging sort of way. And what flashed through my mind was the accounts of after the first Trinity test, when Robert Oppenheimer said, I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Right.
I just thought he does not have a clue as to the magnitude of what these non-human entities are capable of. And it just, to me, the startling thing was, I felt, and I could be wrong, but I felt, here's a man who has bought into the deception. And all he's looking at is not can we do it, or he's asking, can we do it, instead of asking, should we do it? And that attitude is, to me, it's very disturbing. We're capable of great things, and we're capable of great things that we can turn to great evil. And when you're dealing with something that, to a lot of people, and a lot of very intelligent people, seems to be something evil that's manipulating humanity, why would you chance it? Why wouldn't you ask, okay, we can do this, but should we? Should we?
And John Burroughs, do you have any speculation about what Colonel Halt could have said to Senator Exxon that would have caused Exxon to be so enraged? Is John there?
Oh, I'm sorry, Linda, you broke up. I didn't hear my name.
Yeah. Can you speculate on what you think Colonel Halt might have said to Nebraska Senator Exxon about RAF Bentwaters that enraged Senator Exxon?
I think we should look at it from a different angle. And what I mean by that is Ray would have a better idea of what he may or may not have said, other than if he told Exxon it involved technology. But you have to look at the senators that were involved in this. And when people say there's nothing to the Bentwaters case, you have to look at the heavy hitters that were involved. You had Exxon get involved. You had Senator Byrd get involved. Then you had Senator Kyle, who was unable to take the DOD on as far as when it involved my part of it with my records, my injuries, and everything else. And finally, Senator McCain took over when Kyle retired, and he was stonewalled until he threatened to open up a hearing and have an investigation done on the incident, even though it was 36 years later because of what took place. Then you also then have to look at the overall picture with To the Stars, because they're now bringing Rendlesham into this, and they got Senator Reid to sign off on funding some of this. So to me, you have to look at the people that have been behind not just Bentwaters, but are behind the funding of all this. It's hard to trace the money because once it gets inside the DOD, it disappears, as I believe there's just an article written now that the DOD can't account for $6.7 trillion.
Right.
But it does ultimately lead, in my opinion, to technology. Now, what I thought was very revealing that what Ray just said was, maybe that's what the Collins elite is really doing, or whoever they are. They are saying, should we really go there? Should we really weaponize this? Should we really open up those doors? Because if we do, are we going to be able to control it?
And right here for you three, I would like to share something I have not shared with anybody publicly before. 2.5 years ago, when I had the unique opportunity to speak with a physicist who I am convinced worked at Area 51 in the early 1970s, 4 stories underground, could draw for me exactly how he had to get to those floors, the kind of security that he had. One of his assignments was to handle and try to figure out a 3-foot by 6-foot slab of the bismuth, magnesium, zinc layered material that I have been trying to understand and getting to all kinds of scientists since 1996. And after 3 hours with this physicist talking to me about his experiences at Area 51 and beyond, he then said this. He said, you know, what we're really dealing with is the astral plane. He said, that's the dimension that wraps this universe. And in that astral plane, Linda, there are horrible things. And he said, my last assignment I was involved with was how can we go into the astral plane and use artillery, bombs, lasers, weapons to blow things up.
You know, that's really, it's fascinating. That takes me back to a quotation from Robert Jastrow, the astronomer, who said, I believe that when physicists climb the mountain of knowledge and reach the summit, they're going to find the theologians are already on top. And
yeah,
we've reached a point, I think, technologically, where we are encountering those things. You know, Einstein calling quantum mechanics, you know, spooky actions at a distance. We're getting into territory where it's clear the material world is not the be all and end all. There's something beyond it. And so every time I see something just like that, or hear a quotation, the statement that the gentleman you quote, I find that fascinating, that they're saying there are strange things that we can't explain physically.
And you know what it ties into, going all the way back to 1982, when an engineer working at Martin Marietta outside of Denver knew somebody who knew that I had investigated animal mutilations that led to ETs, UFOs, and all of that. And so a meeting was put together so he could talk to me. And he said, I want you to know that I was personally involved in the construction of an all-brick building in a very rural place in Sedona, Arizona. And the brick building that has no windows, we built it around a machine. Inside the all-brick building, the machine's job is to prevent the magnetic fields there from collapsing as they do periodically in nature. It's what comes through from other dimensions into our world when magnetic fields collapse that we are actively trying to block the collapse of magnetic fields in many places around the planet.
That I find that just absolutely fascinating, because one of the things that he's poo-pooed for quite often in the late 60s, John Keel said, because he sort of coined the term window areas, thin spots, right, where these things occur on a regular basis. And he used USGS maps that the government had made of magnetic anomalies, and could link these window areas to areas of magnetic anomalies. That's a fascinating story from him. And
if we've been trying to counter the collapse of magnetic fields at various places around this planet, then the idea that in the early 70s, somebody said we've got to go into the astral plane and blow things up that are attacking us is not so far-fetched. And Nick, in all of your research for all of your books and being based in the UK a lot of the time, did you ever run into anyone who talked about the possibility that why we might have had some kind of special technology in the RAF Bentwaters Woodbridge area in December of 1980, in fact, that whole year and longer before, is because we were manipulating frequencies in order to try to accomplish something militarily?
No, I haven't personally come across anything like that, no.
John, can you share about BOTC at this point?
As far as, you mean weapons testing and stuff?
Yeah, we know from Cobra Mist and those tunnels, underground things from BOTC, that there were things going on from Cobra Mist to whatever was going on in those underground facilities that nobody has ever explained.
Well, if you really want to dig deep in the area, you've got to go back to some of the things we've talked about before. The death ray was developed there, and that involved lasers, which led to radars, which then led, they had stuff going on with Bowsy. They had stuff going on at Marshall Heath. Marconi was behind a lot of it. They've been bought out since, and they continue to do testing there. But you had a known phenomenon that was being studied, by scientists in the area right when our incident took place. And you had all kinds of top secret work going on, to including SDI. And then you could go even deeper into the fact that some of the scientists that were working at the facility with Marconi down at Marshall Heath mysteriously died afterwards, and they were working on lasers and drones and everything else. So there's no doubt there was all kinds of things taking place outside the facility, to include there's a phenomenon in an energy field there. Linda, we uncovered that when we went over there in 10.
Right. Yeah. Explain to the general audience again, John, what we all did and what we found.
Well, you had somebody come down that was an engineer, it had a lot of equipment, and we tested the area for energy fields, and it was uncovered. There was stuff picked up on infrared cameras. And not only that, but if you go into a guy that did a lot of work down there, Andrew Pike looked at it, which ties into Project Condign, which ties into the UAPs, which ties back into the stars. And I believe our producer's letting us know we're getting ready to go to break. But I want to make sure, because tonight I've had a lot of breaking up on my end. Did you guys ever talk about Project MK often?
No, not yet.
Do you know anything about that, Nick?
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, when we come back after this break.
We'll do our first break. When we come back, somebody sent me some stuff on that during the show, and I find that intriguing that our government would spend that kind of money and time and effort and actually have a project involved in all that.
All right. Let's take it away, Bill, to commercial, and we'll come back to start the next segment on the mystery that Nick and John have talked about.
Well, thank you, Linda, John, Ray, and Nick. This 50-minute uninterrupted segment of Phenomenon Radio is brought to you by OnlineVibes.com. Your connection to mind, body, spirit, committed to connecting you with healing modalities that can manifest a true and healthy change in your life. Visit the website at OnlineVibes.com. That's vibes with a Z. Tonight's special guests, Dr. Ray Boeche and Nick Redfern, will be back with Linda and John right after these messages. Welcome back to Phenomenon Radio, live right here on the KGRA digital broadcasting station. Before we begin hour 2 of our interview with special guests Dr. Ray Boeche and Nick Redfern, it's time for the news brought to you exclusively by Earthfiles.com. And here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Hey, Bill, thanks. What is the strange white stuff coming out of the Arcia Mons volcano cone near the equator on Mars? First photographed on September 13th, 2018, it looks like the volcano is belching up white smoke. But that volcano is supposed to be extinct. If it really was belching smoke, it would be a much bigger story than the one planetary scientists are insisting is the correct one. And that is a 930-mile long, that's 1,500 kilometers, white plume is made of cloud vapor, water ice. Well, what is happening? I have photos at my Earthfiles News website right now that show clearly the long, white, narrow plume coming right from the tip of that volcano. But ScienceAlert.com reported just in the last few days, quote, while the long white cloud appears to emerge from the summit of the volcano, to researchers from the European Space Agency, this is a trick of the eye. Mars has not seen a single volcanic eruption for millions of years, so there is zero chance that Arsia Mons is on the verge of reawakening. Still, even if the plume is not volcanic in origin, the elevated peak of Arsia Mons is still responsible, close quote. And the reason is, it's what scientists call an orographic cloud. On Earth, orographic clouds form on the downward side of a mountain when dense air close to the surface flows uphill. That flow causes dust particles to expand, and then they cool to a temperature where moisture can condense into water ice on that dust. The extinct Martian Arsia Mons volcano mountain has had such orographic clouds photographed there before in 2009, 2012, and 2015, but nothing as dramatic as what the scientists at the European Space Agency say that they have since September 9th watched this long cloud grow longer and longer, even over a single morning along the equator. You can check out the great photos that they have been getting and distributing at the European Space Agency of this cloud phenomena on Mars at my news website, earthfiles.com. It's right near the top of the headlines page. And this is Linda Moulton Howe. Please stay tuned to Earthfiles news updates on KGRA Radio, and visit every day my science, environment, and real X-Files news website, earthfiles.com, for more on breaking stories about our universe, this solar system, and the planet we live on.
Thank you, Linda. And that's the news brought to you by earthfiles.com. Now back to tonight's interview with special guests Dr. Ray Boeche and Nick Redfern. Here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Thanks, Bill. And before the break, John Burroughs, you were bringing up a question to Ray and to Nick that sounds very interesting and that many of our listeners may not know anything about.
Nick, I think when we went to the break, you said you've heard of Project MK Often, and I believe it also ties into Project MK Ultra and even Stargate. So can you kind of let the listeners know what you know about it? And I'm shocked that our government and the CIA were involved so much in all of this.
Well, MK Often was a legitimate program that's really had its origins with a guy named Sidney Gottlieb, and he was someone who got a PhD in chemistry in the late 40s, and in 1951 he was offered the position as head of the chemical division of the CIA's Technical Services Staff, the TSS. And then in 53, Gottlieb began overseeing and coordinating all the work of MK Ultra under the orders of the CIA director at the time, who was Alan Dulles. Now, that program, MK Ultra, really sort of got Gottlieb into the heart of the intelligence community. And in the 1960s, he was offered kind of like a really alternative challenge, namely the creation of MK Often, which was basically the intelligence community, particularly the CIA, looking into the use or the exploitation of the world of the supernatural, again, as a way to weaponize it. Now, what we know for sure through the Freedom of Information Act is that the Richard Helms, who went on to become the CIA director from 66 to 73, secured a $150,000 grant for the creation and establishment of Operation Often. And he also worked on, Gottlieb I should say, worked alongside a guy named Dr. Ewan Cameron, who was someone who was doing sort of groundbreaking research into helping people who had psychological conditions, mental illness, and things like that. But as time went on, MK often sort of really went down paranormal pathways, so to speak, to the point, but by May 1971, the operation had three astrologers on the payroll who were getting $350 a week, which wasn't bad in 1971. And they also had on board fortune tellers, palmists, clairvoyants, demonologists, and mediums. Now, the group, nobody really knows what happened to the group. It's sort of very hazy as to what happened after the early to mid-1970s. But if you look at the fact that people like Gottlieb, you know, they're heavily plugged into the intelligence community, heavily involved in mind-altering technologies and the world of alternative technologies and weaponizing the occult. Now, I don't have any proof of what I'm going to say now, but based on all that, I think it's almost inconceivable that that they would not have crossed paths with the Collins elite, because they were covering so much similar ground, the world of the paranormal, how to sort of quite literally take out foreign leaders by cursing them. That was like one of the ideas. Wow. So, you know, if you put those issues together, I think sort of concerted effort might actually find some genuine, intriguing links that that place Operation Often, MK Often, in conjunction with the Collins elite, because the areas were so close together.
And Nick, is it project, is it MK and then the word OFTEN, like frequent, often?
Well, yeah, it is like often, but it's there's no spaces. It's like MK Often, like seven letters all in one. And now other people refer to it as Operation Often, which was more the sort of unofficial title. The official one, like MK Naomi, MK Ultra, the official one was MK Often. And
it preceded MK Ultra.
No, it actually came back in the early 60s. What happened was that Sidney Gottlieb got involved in the 50s with MK Ultra, continued that work through the early 60s, and then Richard Helms, who went on to be the CIA director from 66 onwards, he then encouraged Gottlieb to get involved with this new program they got to try and weaponize the world of the paranormal. Now, I haven't found any information that suggests that MK Often were looking into the UFO subject, but as I said, the fact that both the Collins elite or some sort of offshoot of it was trying to find a way to weaponize the technology of the NHEs, then to me it seems likely that they did have some sort of crossover, because you know, just to share data and try and, you know, push forward both programs as they saw.
Now, Nick, what was the name? And I have it on the tip of my tongue. There was a project that they said took place on the East Coast using radars, correct? That was involved with MK Ultra and mind control. It was on an island. That's why my mind went blank.
Plum? Was it on Plum Island?
No. If I could remember the name of the project, which has been talked about heavily, some of it's been denied, some of it's true, but ultimately it was tied to MK Ultra, but the interesting thing was to me was that they were actually doing research on frequencies.
I'm not sure of that one. There's a place in Mississippi, in Pascagoula, called Horn Island, which in the 50s and 60s was doing research and experiments into mind-altering chemicals and technologies back then. I don't know if that's the one.
I wonder if that's why those robots showed up to Hickson and those guys that were out there fishing. Yep. Pascagoula. Yep. And a lot of people, they say, when we did interviews recently having to do with this book out, he was saying that the shipyards there, they were highly sensitive highly guarded, all kinds of secrecy that the general U.S. would have been shocked to know that Pascagoula was the center of so much secret, we'll call it, where big ships came and went.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, a lot of these sort of key UFO cases do seem to have aspects in relation to mind control and, mind-altering technologies. And the Pascagoula one, is perceived as a classic UFO event. 1973, these Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker saw these weird creatures and taken aboard this craft. A lot of people don't realize just literally like 3 or 4 miles from that part of the Mississippi River was exactly where on Horn Island the military was performing these experiments in mind-altering technologies. One of them, called BZ, nicknamed Buzz, which has causes graphic hallucinations, when you're dosed with BZ.
Wow.
It was, guys, I looked it up. It was Montauk Park.
Oh, Montauk.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay. Project Montauk. But what was funny was that was all supposedly taking place when MK Ultra was revealed. The CIA destroyed all their documents, said they'd shut the program down, but they really totally didn't. And a lot of people speculated that the program was just moved overseas, possibly even some of it to the UK. But what was intriguing to me about that was it involved radars and frequencies.
Nick, do you remember in the BZ, do you remember anything about whether they were using electromagnetic frequency changes or chemistry?
No, as far as I can remember it, I mean, basically BZ is like it's hallucinogenic, and if you're hit with it, you'll have like a definitive trip, and but a lot of this research was born out of the original MK Ultra programs, where over time it was just expanded into different areas, but with the ability to find various different ways to alter the human mind. But BZ, which is nicknamed as Buzz, quite appropriately, you find that it has causes incredible hallucinations, and kind of like LSD, in many respects, the kind of trip you have, it depends on the kind of the setting and the mood and everything else. If someone takes LSD and they're in a fraught situation and frightened that it's all going to go wrong, the chances are they would get a very bad trip. If their mood is, let's try it, I want to find out what's going to happen, it's likely to be far more relaxing and eye-opening, so to speak. And the same is with BZ, that the mindset has a great deal of impact on the outcome.
And John, in terms of some of the speculation or rumors about what might have been happening at RAF Bentwaters at the time that Cobra missed, and the experimentation of things in Botsy, what we found out in the field, that there was still something that would cause that needle on the trifield meter to peg and not come down. Have you ever talked with anybody who was there who said that there were experiments ongoing having to do with mind altering?
I've never been able to get anybody to directly admit that was going on, other than if you do your research and you look at the people behind some of this, if you look at the fact that, and I'll bring up an individual that's in the field, Nick Pope, but his father was head of technology, during the time of our event. He was head of the UK in the MOD's technology division. Okay. You had Kit Green, who has been involved in Rendlesham. He was working for the CIA and was involved in technology both from America, and was definitely involved in what the Soviets were doing. If you look at what Alessandro said and others, there at the point during that incident, and even to today, the Soviets are ahead of us in some of this, which I find, intriguing as far as that we have all these weapons we've developed, yet if you go back to what we've been talking about tonight, if what we speculate is true and it can be weaponized and figured out, it would make all these weapons just non-functional. They would just not matter if you could actually control what we've gone into tonight, what Ray, Nick, and you guys have worked on over the years. So I find this intriguing, and I also find it intriguing that, like Linda, you've talked about frequencies. Yeah. Well, a lot of this started taking place, in our time frame is back in the 40s, and it started with Roswell's when radar became active.
Yeah, exactly. And they were using, not only were they experimenting with radar, they were trying to jack up the microwave frequencies as high as they possibly could. And there is some, I'm going to say, partial evidence that we triangulated with really high microwaves. We triangulated up to Albuquerque, to Moriarty, and down to Roswell with the idea that if we could get the right frequencies, we could destroy the UFOs coming into our sensitive airspace. And Stanton Friedman knew about that. Other people, there was a senator from Las Cruces, a state senator, who introduced me to the photographs and the concept of working with strong microwaves in triangulation in order to try to bring down UFOs.
Right, but what's interesting is, unfortunately, my take, and I'd like to hear Ray's and Nick's, is that mankind, and I don't mean all of mankind, I don't mean the everyday Joe, but it seems the people in power, no matter what country it is, they want to weaponize everything. They want to have ultimate control. And that's what makes tonight's show so intriguing, is that if there's something out there that scares people that badly inside the Department of Defense, what does that mean?
Well, I think the big thing about, scaring people is that it's easier to control people. You terrify people and they'll say, just get us out of this situation. They don't want to know how it's going to be done. Just save us,
Go ahead, John. Or Nick, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just saying that I think, when people are frightened, it's far easier to control them. And that's as disturbing as it is graphic, that people will give up their rights for this or their rights for that, providing that everything will be okay, and I think there's a danger you can cross the line in that situation of putting people into a place of fear as a means to turn them into a herd, basically.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't it Jefferson who said, he who would trade freedom for security loses both?
Yes. And Nick, did your father that you've written about, that he knew about UFO incidents, did he ever give you any insight about the questions we all have? Are there friendlies and hostiles?
Not as specifically, no. But I mean, John might find this interesting because back in the 50s, my dad worked as a radar mechanic in the British Royal Air Force, and he was stationed at a Royal Air Force base, which John may know of, Royal Air Force Neatis Head. And I don't know if you know that one, John, at all.
Yeah, it supposedly was involved in our incident. It was the triangular tripe.
Yeah. Well, my dad was stationed at Neatis Head in the 50s as a radar mechanic, and he was involved in 3 nights' worth of UFO incidents during a NATO operation called Mainbrace in September 52, which you can actually find a lot of now declassified files on Mainbrace and UFOs in the public domain. And my dad was brought in as a radar mechanic to check out the equipment because the guys who were running the radars were picking up these strange objects flying at incredible speeds and heights, and they were trying to figure out if they were getting real readings or was it down to malfunctions. That's why my dad was brought in, and it turns out there were no malfunctions, and whatever these things were, they came back 3 nights. Fighter planes were scrambled, etc., etc. You know, the scenario we have so many times. And my dad and the rest of the team were told, you know, you've signed the British government's Official Secrets Act. You won't talk about this. And my dad didn't talk about it till I was just a young kid. And that's really what got me interested. But not just because it was my own father's experience, but because he was someone trained in the military on radar. And that sort of really opened my eyes to, wow, you know, this is a real phenomenon. But he didn't have, I should stress, he didn't have any, you know, inside insight or anything like that. He was sort of on, you know, on the periphery of it, so to speak.
Well, Nick, do you think based on your father's work, you know, as far as with radars and stuff, that a lot of this, and even if you got into the demonic stuff of it, is based on other dimensions and other frequencies, and the scariest thing in all this would be if we can learn to control these frequencies and modulate them. That could be a huge problem for, you know, other countries if one country gains access to it first, but also would be how whatever it is would react if we actually did that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you're talking about other realities and things like that, I mean, when I first got into this in sort of my early teens or thereabouts, you know, it was all very black and white, as things kind of are when you're that age, you know, and I thought it was just aliens from other worlds. And but certainly by the time I was in my 20s, you know, I'd sort of come far more around the idea that John Keel was talking about of, you know, were these things extraterrestrial or just from other realms of existence, you know, multiple dimensions. And I've sort of really, you know, kept that belief system since then, really. Now, you know, whether you view them as like heaven and hell or multiple dimensions or portals to other realms that we don't understand, I think something along those lines is likely the answer, rather than just little green men coming from this star system or that star system. I think there's enough weirdness out there that also links, you know, ufology with other phenomena as well, like cryptozoology in some cases, and the world of the paranormal, which I don't think you would get if we were just dealing with someone else's equivalent of NASA. So, you know, I think the idea that you know, portals, doorways, multiple dimensions, I think all of this is being researched primarily because of the military application, you know, where in theory, you know, could you sort of zip from one place to another in seconds and, you know, take the enemy by surprise?
Exactly. The physicist told me 2.5 years ago, he said, I know for a fact that we have at least been exposed to or have been taken in craft to demonstrate that if you want to move from, let's say, 4 billion light years after the beginning of this particular universe to where we are at 13.8 approximately, or wherever we are in that 13.8 billion year old universe. He said the way that the intelligences that we're dealing with do it, they go out into another dimension and do a cushion shot into this dimension exactly where they want to go. And it would be like the Philip Dick story, where the ability to move in the universe was as simple as having a doorway. And on one side was one space-time coordinate, and on the other was another. And in between was this ability to cushion shot into dimension and back.
Yeah, and I mean, Philip K. Dick was someone who, had a lot of interest in theories, and to a degree, he did wonder, or to a significant degree, he did wonder if he was sort of being, almost sort of manipulated or downloaded material and thoughts and concepts into his mind, and so I think, that's an interesting angle, Philip K. Dick himself, having this idea that perhaps he was in touch with aliens of some sort, or at least non-human entities, and that they were, were somehow influencing. But yeah, the story you're talking about is the Adjustment Bureau, which was made into a big movie a few years ago. Yes,
and that idea that Philip K. Dick would be getting a download telepathically in dreams, or his ability to think as a writer, but was painting the idea of a cosmos so different that it could just be walked around in metaphorically.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also, similar. One of my bigger interests, which I've now done 5 books on, is the Men in Black mystery. And, it's clear that within minutes, most people would realize they're nothing like, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, the movie versions. But if you look at the real MIB stories, they look very creepy and pale and odd-looking, plastic-like skin, and very intimidating by their weird appearance. But they seem to have this ability to flit in and out of our reality. They're sort of here 1 second, they leave the front door and they're gone the next second. People see them sort of materializing in the bedroom in the dead of night. And I think the Men in Black angle is a perfect example of sort of this almost like dimension hopping phenomena. Right. Is sort of really portrayed when you look at a lot of these MIB stories.
Well, in talking with Luis Elizondo, when I transferred the bismuth magnesium down to San Diego August 5th, one of the things that we were talking about was the FLIR video and the pilots, not just the ones that were released in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, but others, in which the pilots are stunned because they know that what they are seeing in terms of the distance between what we'll call it the UFO signature on the FLIR is, and where it goes, it would be maybe 15,000, 20,000 miles an hour, and doing something like a 90-degree turn. There's no organic human that could take something like that. So that it means that the craft are either self-activating software with no intelligence in them, because the craft is the intelligence. That's one. 2, that we're dealing with androids made specifically to travel the space-time, and that they interact with the self-activating software of the craft. So the craft and the beings are one, and that they are not limited by inertial and gravity and all of the problems that a human organic being would have. And then the other is that they are being able to manipulate dimensional in, out, and that we have captured it on FLIR video. And what we have seen, the pilots have seen, and the radar, or the FLIR and the radar have seen, is impossible in terrestrial physics.
That brings to mind project identification. Harley, he was an astronomer, taught astronomy at Southeastern Missouri State University in Cape Girardeau, I believe. Harley Rutledge.
Yeah.
He had his students studying the appearance of some of these objects in the sky. And if I remember correctly, there were several frames of film, still film, that they took that, for all intents and purposes, it looked like this light source would start and stop a dozen times within the 30th of a second frame of film exposure time. And he puzzled then. This was back in the early 80s. How was it possible for a physical craft to do that, to start and stop and start and stop that many times in a 30th of a second?
Right. And one of the reasons he called me was because they were having mutilations. And,
that's right.
Yeah. And so we had long discussions on the phone. I think eventually I met him once, but we had long discussions about what it was that he and the university students were trying to figure out in terms of just matter motion, and that what they were out studying in the night sky was in the same place where there were lots of mutilated animals.
Gosh, where have we seen that before?
Yeah. All interconnected. And the dimensional jump. I mean, Ray, did you get into that with the NSA DIA guys?
We didn't. They didn't talk, as far as I can remember, specifically about that. But it would certainly fall within the realm of the things that they did discuss. You could see where that would be part of it, and part of the attraction to want to weaponize this information or these abilities that the NHEs were providing to them. It'd be tempting for any government to want to do that.
And then part of the whole weapon would be that your enemy would be given some kind of a very false visual, either a holographic or mind penetration, and that would divert the enemy or cause the enemy to turn around and run because they were seeing something horrific.
Or if, for instance, let's go back to Harley Rutledge and Project Identification. If you were able to pilot a craft that could jump from dimension to dimension in split microseconds, how would you ever lock in and target that to fire a weapon against it? Wow. It would seem to be kind of the ultimate defense, because you're there, but you're not really there. And so it's all kinds of fascinating things to speculate about.
And you know what, Ray, when the Japanese were working with Billy My-Ear, and that was at a period of time in the early 80s where I got contacted by, I think his name was Jimmy Chow from out of Tokyo, and they were going around the country in the United States, and they had been to see Billy My-Ear in the Switzerland, Austria area, where allegedly the tall blondes and brunettes that were humanoid females, Semyase and the others, were coming to Billy My-Ear's farm all the time and allowing him to take photographs, and it was 8mm film. And I saw in a Japanese, they showed it to me one time. They let me sit in a room with them looking at a lot of the Billy My-Ear footage. And it was footage, if it were allowed to run, just like they showed me, it would be really impressive in a public forum, because you'd be seeing the craft right in front of the camera, and then it would jump. I mean, literally pop out and then pop into a frame much further away. And then they had 8mm film that appeared to have been taken of something like from the point of view of the craft filming another craft in the atmosphere. And this was all stuff that the Japanese had, that My-Ear had given them, with the idea that the ETs dealing with My-Ear were trying to be friendly and demonstrate their technology so that Billy My-Ear could write about it in a book for humans. And those were those big square books. Remember, they came out. The first volume was December of 1979, because Leo Sprinkle called me and said, Linda, you have to have this book by Billy My-Ear. And I had talked on the phone. My first interview with Jacques Vallée was that summer in 79, he had been to visit Billy Meyer, and Jacques Vallée told me from his mouth to my ear on the phone that he had seen original negatives, original 8mm film, had walked all over the land and was convinced that Billy Meyer was telling the truth.
That's interesting. That is fascinating.
Yeah. And if with these things popping in and out of existence, and yet what interacted with Meyer were allegedly what? Tall, blonde, humanoid semyase? That was the same name of what? On the angels list from the old biblical testaments.
That's right.
And she was supposed to be an angel, quote unquote, with the bad one, Azazel and Semyase. And Azazel was supposed to be one of the worst of the worst. So here you get in one story in the early 70s being studied by a lot of people with film, photographs of neighbors that said they saw these silver craft down over the trees on the Meyer ranch or farm. And yet, if the name is Semyase, and historically going back 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years, Semyase is on the list of angels with Azazel. You can look these up. They are not supposed to be our friends. And
That's
yet,
right.
Billy Meyer would say that he loved Semyase because she was beautiful.
And there's the difficult part. What's deception and what's truth?
Which is exactly what the writers were telling us. And I was reading about that they are neither benign nor neutral, the non-human entities.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating.
And so where are we?
Linda?
Today? Yeah.
I have a question for Ray, but I wanted to bring something up that's actually taking place before I ask that, where you talk about how these craft can appear and reappear and all that. Well, what's interesting is the DoD actually has created EM generators, and it's been used both on destroyers, the Zumwalt's one of them, where it can make the actual ship disappear. It's there, but it's not, almost like what they did supposedly back in the 40s. But one of the things that's happened, I think we've talked about it on the show before, was with the tanks. They'll have a tank going along, they'll activate the EM generator, the tank will disappear, and then when it reappears, it should be going from point A to B. It actually shows up over at C.
And what is C?
C is not where it's supposed to be. In other words, like if you were going along a straight line and you were supposed to go from here to there, it ends up to the right or left. And when they activate the generator, it affects the course of the tank, and the computers and everything else can't react to it because it's involving EM generators and frequencies. So frequencies are altering the path of the tank and where it ends up. And it's done that with the actual destroyers too, which kind of goes back to what you guys are talking about, these craft and where they pop in and out.
Yes, and it also ties into something that I have been learning from also another scientist from long ago. This is from a 4-hour interview I did recently, and it's just a tiny insight. He said that in all of the work that he has done in relationship to trying to understand what other intelligences are that interact with this planet, that he personally was involved with demonstrations that the non-human intelligence uses time travel, time deflection, time changes constantly, is their manipulation of our planet without our realizing it. And this is the example he gave. He said, even if they change one blood vessel on a back of a hand, he was using this as an example of something he knew. so that scientist would collapse from a heart attack and die. Just changing a tiny blood vessel didn't violate some universal law, but they knew that this is what the non-human intelligences were capable of, because they had computers that could show that by changing a blood vessel in the right hand of a scientist who would then later on collapse and die, would then change a whole branch having to do with science, the evolution of the planet, and their ability to manipulate and control us.
You know, that goes back, Linda, I think, to what the writers referenced, David Boeche and his theory of unfoldment.
Yeah.
Where everything that has happened is in some sense still going on. And Boeche was able to was the developer of the holograph by being able to combine the collision of frequencies to produce a three-dimensional image that's complete no matter how small a fragment of the original glass you have. But it's interesting that that they're talking about that, because that's a fascinating aspect of that.
And Ray, what would the relationship be between intelligences in the astral plane who are not our friends, that they want control in this universe that is self-serving to them? What is the penetration physics? What is it that we thought, that physicists said, that we could block by doing something to get into the astral plane? What is the physics of dimensional penetrations?
That's a fascinating question. And if and I believe there are scientists who are working strictly on that, but yet when you see the how do I want to term it, the public icons of science who poo-poo anything that isn't naturalistic or materialistic, I'm always intrigued what's really going on in the background, what's really being dug into that they don't want to talk about.
Yeah, and it's like Stanton Friedman did so much valuable research in finding out that Menzel at Harvard, an astronomer, was actually appointed by Truman to be on the MJ-12 list to deal with extraterrestrials. And Menzel was the greatest debunker. And yet Stanton has hard proof that he was on MJ-12 list. Well, who did Menzel bring into the next baton handover? It would appear to be Carl Sagan.
Uh-huh.
And then what does Carl Sagan do? He becomes the greatest debunker of UFOs, and yet he's the one who makes Cosmos, the billions and billions and billions of planets, right? Opening up the concept of other life in the universe while they were controlling Sagan with there's nothing to UFOs and ETs.
Fascinating.
Ray, I really wanted just to ask you this, because if it doesn't, just say no and we'll move on. But a while back, I was intrigued by Enoch, the book of Enoch, and how it was pulled. So I tried to get a copy. It took me forever to get a copy. And even after I got a copy of it, I don't know if I got the actual original, doctrine. And then I tried to talk to a few ministers about it, and they don't want to touch it. Does any of that book of Enoch play into any of this at all?
Oh, yes.
The book of Enoch is a fascinating thing. It's in Orthodox Judaism, it was never considered to be an inspired book, but it figures prominently in ancient Jewish thought, in Jewish mysticism, and it's accorded, if not canonical status, meaning it's part of the that which was given directly by God, it's certainly held in great esteem as a very great source of wisdom. I think most pastors are unfamiliar with it because it's not, how do I want to say, its reputation has been sullied because too many people have given a little too much emphasis to it, or tried to make that the standard by which everything else is judged. And so most pastors won't have anything to do with it. They don't want to do it. They won't comment on it because they don't know anything about it. But there's a lot of interesting things in the Book of Enoch, and there are a lot of parallels in the Book of Enoch that you can draw with the rest of Scripture.
Ray, could
yes.
Just quote, I have a lot on the Book of Enoch in My Glimpses, Volume 2.
Yes.
Here, I am quoting from a very respected Trinity College, Dublin, and Exeter College, Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1896 was the printing of this Book of Enoch. And it says, according to Enoch, he had a startling visit in his bedroom one night by, quote, 2 men very tall, such as I have never seen on earth. And their faces shone like the sun, they're glowing, and their eyes were like burning lamps, their hands whiter than snow. The tall, strange men named Samuel and Raguel took Enoch on their wings and placed him on clouds that moved. And then they show him 7 heavens. And he reports that he saw troublemakers and evildoers in the 2nd and 3rd levels of heaven of the 7 shown to him by the tall glowing men. That paradoxical description of evil in heaven bothered the rabbis at the Council of Nicaea when they put together the classical Bible. And that's when they threw out the Book of Enoch, because he said that the tall glowing men had showed him evil in the 2nd and 3rd levels of heaven, which tonight we could say have to do with other dimensions beyond this one.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are, typically, when heaven is referred to, the heavens are referred to in ancient Jewish literature, they're generally talking about 3 heavens. The atmosphere is the first heaven. Outer space is the second heaven, and the third heaven is that transdimensional realm where God dwells and the spirit beings dwell. But that
Enoch goes on to fourth heaven, the phoenixes and the chalkidri, armed hosts serving the Lord. The 5th heaven, the watchers whose fallen brethren are Satanael, Azazel that I was talking about.
Yep.
That Enoch had already seen tormented in the 2nd heaven because they were evil. The 6th heaven had 7 bands of angels and record keepers over all the souls of men who write down all mankind's works and their lives. And in the 7th heaven were 10 great orders of angels in ranks, a strict pecking order that apparently Satanael and Azazel tried to change. Their punishment for disobeying God's rules was banishment to the 2nd heaven. Now, the 2nd heaven in the physicist's language could be the astral plane that surrounds this universe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not put off by the idea of the 7 heavens. There's a lot in ancient Jewish literature that is unfortunately ignored and given short shrift by current theologians. The one person that I would say, I don't know if you've ever had him on, but Michael Heiser would be an excellent guest for you to talk with. Michael Heiser is an ancient language expert, and he's the ancient language scholar for Logos Bible software, one of the, if not the premier scholarly Bible software. Fascinating man, and he's written a book called The Unseen Realm, which talks about Enoch and the Watchers and the Nephilim, and from a solidly Orthodox Christian viewpoint. And a lot of Christian scholars don't like what he's found because it goes against the assumptions that they had been taught to make, that you just disregard this, you don't look into this.
And Ray, one of the single most important Enoch writings, it took an act of law for Professor Robert Eisenman to get this particular Testament of Omron gotten out. It had been a Dead Sea Scroll from 47 on, and that those who were keeping the Dead Sea Scrolls from the world, that he filed a lawsuit to get this, and it finally happened in 1993 to 1994. Took that long, 1947 to the early 90s. And here is what that scroll said that somebody wanted to keep from the world. Enoch, quote, "I saw watchers in my vision, the dream vision. 2 men were fighting over me, holding a great contest over me. I asked them, 'Who are you that you are thus empowered over me?' They answered, 'We have been empowered and rule over all mankind.' They said to me, 'Which of us do you choose to rule you?' I raised my eyes and I looked. One of them was terrifying in his appearance, like a serpent, his cloak many-colored yet very dark. And I looked again, and in his appearance, his visage like a viper. I replied to him, 'This watcher, who is he?' He answered, 'This watcher, his 3 names are Belial, Prince of Darkness, and King of Evil.' I said to the other watcher, 'My Lord, what dominion have you?' He answered, 'You saw the viper, and he is empowered over all darkness, while I am empowered over all light. My 3 names are Michael, Prince of Light, and King of Righteousness.'" This is a very important text from Enoch that might have to do with reptilians versus blondes, who have been trying to kill each other for millennia, according to people in the DIA, CIA, and NSA.
Yeah, you're seeing here the exactly the same thing that the writers were trying to get across to us, what they had discovered, what they were working with.
Yep.
You're seeing, okay, here's how ancient Jewish culture recorded this, and it's fascinating. And if I can't stress strongly enough, I think if you can get Mike Heiser, that would be a fascinating show.
All right,
that would be a fascinating show.
I will try, and we're coming up close. Nick, is there anything about this last few minutes having to do with Enoch and the issue of so-called biblical literature about gods that men got down on their knees to, that were not gods, never were actually intelligences from other dimensions or other places? Does that ring true with your own investigations?
Well, I think, the Book of Enoch is an interesting one, and because you can interpret it as, sort of like a celestial flight, that kind of thing. And I guess, what it comes down to is how you interpret it, more than anything else. But, there's no doubt that you can, really place it in kind of like the context of almost like a modern day, well, not a modern day, but a 1950s contactee experience, when you had these people claiming that they were taken into the skies and, saw the moon and things like that, which are highly controversial stories. But if you place them in that context, like paralleling like something like the Book of Enoch, it's in certain places, it's not dissimilar. So, again, you're looking at as I see it, we're looking at a very ancient phenomenon that's used us and manipulated us in various ways over the centuries. And I think, as you said, with the writers, I think Jacques Vallée actually really was and still is, on the right path when he talked about, some of these events seeming to be staged and more for the benefit of the witness rather than just, a random event where somebody happens to come across a UFO. And, I think manipulation and sort of, presenting the phenomenon presenting itself as something that it actually isn't, and it may have portrayed itself throughout millennia, goblins, fairies, you name it, aliens.
And one more word from that physicist from 2.5 years ago. He said that the soul of Homo sapiens sapien, our soul, that even in some circles in this modern world are dismissed as that it's not real. He said the soul is the most important part. The body is the container. And that there are raging battles to try to get human souls so that those entities in the astral plane that make it from there into here, in order to stay here in this universe, they have to get a soul and a container.
Interesting. That's interesting. That reminds me of a statement C.S. Lewis said, that we are not bodies who contain souls. We're souls who wear bodies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And add that one more layer that I have talked a little bit about, the DIA guy who told me World War II was an extraterrestrial war, and tonight we could add other dimensional war that was fought through human bodies that were controlled and manipulated by other competing forces.
Mm.
And that may be where the truth is and why it is so difficult for our government and other governments to tell humans the truth. But I am convinced, Ray and Nick, that if we are not told the whole bloody truth soon, then humans will not survive all the lies.
It's amazing what stays hidden. One last thing before we go. I'm not a member of the Collins Elite. I wasn't brought in to help the Collins Elite.
We've come back full circle.
If the Collins Elite is interested in talking to me, I'll talk. But let's clear that up once and for all.
All right. And Ray, on that, let's go to break with Bill. But thank you. And thank you, Nick Redfern, for being here on this fascinating 2 hours on Phenomena Radio.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Linda.
And with that, thanks Linda Moulton Howe, John Burroughs, Dr. Ray Boeche, and Nick Redfern. Thanks for listening to Phenomenon Radio. Now stay tuned for 3 hours of Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the station that brings you the very best in alternative talk radio on the planet, KGRAradio.com. Good night, everyone.